Hey, it's Jeremiah Taylor with Movoto, and welcome to April 2024's edition of The Home Stretch. Now, if you have been paying attention to real estate news at all in the last couple months, I'm sure you have heard a ton about NAR, the National Association of Realtors, proposed $418 million settlement with past home sellers. Now, we're going to take just a minute to talk about what this was about and how it could impact you as a home buyer or home seller going forward. Now, number one, this is all about what's called the offer of cooperation. Now, what that means is in the past, when somebody would go to list a home for sale and they would list it with a real estate agent, that agent would charge them a commission. Now, that commission was negotiable between the seller and that agent. That agent then, with the instruction of the seller, would offer some percentage of that commission to the agent who brought a ready, willing, and able buyer. And that was known as the offer of cooperation. It was unilateral and it was binding. So meaning if I was an agent representing a seller, I would put in the MLS, I'm going to offer X percentage to any agent that brings a ready, willing, and able buyer. And the MLS and the Association of Realtors would guarantee that if you brought a buyer to that property, you would get paid that amount of cooperation that was offered in the MLS. Well, there was a class of homeowners that were home sellers that came together and they said, hey, our agent really didn't explain to us that we could negotiate this. We thought it was standard. And so we just offered the percentage they told us to offer. And hey, well, why did we pay for the buyer's agent? The buyer should have paid for their agent. And so in this proposed settlement, there are two big changes to the way that real estate works that are being proposed. Number one, that offer of cooperation, meaning that a seller offering broadly to the market saying, hey, if you bring a ready, willing, and able buyer, I will pay you this, will likely go away. Meaning, that doesn't mean that a seller's ability to pay somebody who brings a ready, willing, and able buyer goes away. It just means broadcasting that offer goes away. The second thing is that for a buyer who's going to be working with an agent, that agent should have a clear conversation with the buyer to articulate what they charge, why they charge it, and have their buyer sign some sort of representation agreement so that the buyer understands what they are paying that agent to represent them. Now, likely what will happen then is that the agent will negotiate as part of the contract and it will ultimately get net out of the proceeds in close to the same way that it does today. But it should create more transparency so that the buyer understands what they're paying for and so that the buyer, the seller, and the agents involved in the transaction can negotiate. All these things are super healthy. Anytime you bring transparency, it increases trust. It's going to increase the value that agents provide. It's going to increase the amount with which they need to articulate the value that they provide. Now, it's not set in stone yet. All these changes are supposed to go into effect in July. That's what's proposed. Now, we're still going to need the Department of Justice to weigh in, the courts to weigh in, etc. So expect some things will change. But here's what we know today. The majority of MLS listings today in April of 2024 have an offer of cooperation in there. So if you were to buy a house today, you could generally expect that the seller of the house that you are going to be buying is offering to compensate the agent that would be representing you. So that could be a bit of motivation if somebody was worried about this to say, hey, maybe I should do this sooner than later before these proposed changes in July take effect, and maybe you have to pay your own agent. The reality is you probably won't have to pay your own agent. You'll probably end up negotiating it as part of the contract and it'll get net out of the proceeds that go to the seller. But if you're worried, it could be a reason to move a little faster. So we will keep bringing you more information as it breaks here. But let's talk a little bit now about interest rates. So interest rates, everybody knows, a couple years ago, back at end of 2020, they ran up like crazy and they've kind of stayed high, and that's really chasing inflation. But after decreasing for the last couple of weeks, mortgage rates started to creep back up again as we saw some of that inflation data come in a little hotter than expected. And so they were on the upswing at the end of March back to 6.87% or so. Now, as the spring home buying season kicks off, rates still remain near the low end of the 52-week range. So, meaning best opportunity in the last year as far as rates go, but we are seeing a slightly upward trend. Watch for that to change as the Fed potentially follows through on what they've said they're going to do in terms of cutting rates 3 more times this year. Now, what's really interesting is as you look at these rates, you would expect this to really be putting a dampener on home sales. But when you look at the market, history typically tends to repeat itself. And guess what? It's February, and every February for the last 1, 2, 3, 4, as long as I've been doing this February, you see an uptick in activity. I always say the buyers go to sleep over Thanksgiving. It's something about that tryptophan, and they come back out when the Super Bowl happens. And this year is no different. It's just like every other February. We got a really nice bump in spring home buying activity and expect that to continue. So what that means is if you're a buyer and you're thinking about buying this year, you should think about doing that sooner than later, because we will see more competition enter the market as we move into June, etc., and further into the spring home selling season, because it looks like this year is going to do the same thing that every year does seasonally. Now, if rates stay flat, if rates come down, they could add to that, they could slow it down. We'll see, we'll watch, we'll keep bringing you the data every single month. But when you look at prices, this is really interesting, because as we ran up into the pandemic, what we saw was that home prices generally year over year would move up somewhere between 5 and 6%. And that was in the 8 years leading up to the pandemic. Now, during the pandemic, there was a run on housing supply. Prices grew by strong double digits for several years in a row. They were a little bit softer last year as we dealt with those interest rate spikes. But now this year, it's looking like we are returning back to that 5 to 6% normal year over year price growth. So it's healthy. It's what we expect for long-term price growth in the market. So what's all this mean? They're good trends to be aware of. But the reality is, if you're somebody and you're thinking about buying a home, there's 3 things you should really think about that are the 3 important things, because ultimately, the market is always going to be changing, and your personal life situation is the thing that is going to make the most difference and be the most determinant factor in whether it's a good time to buy or not. So 3 things to consider: your credit score, what you have for other debts, and your down payment. So with your credit score, there's a ton of free tools out there where you can monitor your score every month. One of the key things you can do is keep your revolving balances low, and that will help boost your score. So there's kind of a credit score hack here that if you pay your balance low right before the day that your statement cuts, so that when your statement cuts, your balance is at that low point, you could get a significant boost to your FICO score. Also here at Movoto, we have credit repair, and we're happy to introduce you to credit repair companies if you need a little bit of help rebuilding and repairing your credit. Now, speaking of high interest debt, one of the things that's really interesting is today we hear people, they say like, well, I'd love to refinance my house and pay off some debt, but gosh, interest rates are 7 and currently my mortgage is at 2. Well, hey, if you refinance your 2% mortgage to pay off a 27% credit card with a 5 or 6% interest rate or 7% interest rate on that refi, there are times when it makes sense and the net payment is actually better. So pay attention to the total debt that you're carrying and the total debt load that you're paying, and do your best to pay off that high interest rate debt. It's going to make it harder to qualify for a house because a lot of times those are big payments. And also it's going to impact your score based on what's called your utilization ratio, meaning what percentage of your total available credit are you using? The lower the better. 5 to 10% is optimal. Anytime you're over 50%, it could be a significant impact to your score. In fact, that utilization rate drives over 30% of your credit score. So pay down that high interest debt. And finally is your down payment. In a market environment like we're in today, where interest rates are 7%, 8%, 6%, whatever they are, that down payment is more meaningful than it has been in the past. When interest rates were 2 and 3, maybe it didn't make as much sense to put a bunch of money down because the borrowing cost for that capital was so low. But as rates stay higher and they stay higher longer, it could make a lot of sense, because in today's world, you may be paying $6 to $7 per month for every $1,000 that you borrow. So when you start talking about putting an extra $5,000 or $10,000 down, that can be a meaningful savings to your monthly mortgage payment. So keep saving, pay down that high interest debt, and be a great steward of your credit score, and you will be home ready faster than you know it and ready to take advantage of the opportunity that exists in this market. Signing off, it's Jeremiah Taylor with the Home Stretch here from Movoto.